What if the very ideas we champion, ideas meant to help society, actually end up making things worse in the long run? What if, the path to true freedom is radically different from what many of us believe?
That's a challenging thought to start with.
It is. Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're embarking on a journey into a really foundational work, one that dares to challenge some very common assumptions about how society should be organized.
That's right. Today, our deep dive takes us into Milton Friedman's seminal work, Capitalism and Freedom. It's a powerful and pretty persuasive argument that profoundly shaped and, frankly, continues to shape how many people think about the relationship, that intricate link between economic systems and individual liberty.
And crucially, this isn't
Yeah, that's important. It's meant to be accessible, and it's packed with surprising insights that might just challenge what you think about, everything from your job to how you plan for retirement. We've got the preface and the first 12 chapters to unpack today, so we're getting a really good comprehensive view of his core arguments.
Our mission today, then, is to cut through any perceived complexity and really extract the most important nuggets of knowledge, the key insights from Friedman's work. We'll aim to simplify his core concepts, explain every philosophical idea as if you're, completely new to the topic, maybe use some real-world analogies to make his arguments as clear as possible.
Think of this as your shortcut, maybe, to truly understanding a perspective that, when it first came out, was actually considered pretty out of the mainstream. But it has since become remarkably, maybe even profoundly influential.
It might challenge some of your deepest assumptions, and honestly, that's exactly why it's so important to explore. I'm genuinely curious to see how he builds his case here, because let's face it, some of his claims are pretty provocative. So let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
So if freedom is so central, where do we even start trying to understand it? Friedman dives right in, headfirst really, into what he calls a widespread delusion, challenging a belief many of us probably just take for granted.
Yeah, he points out that many people, and he specifically mentions intellectuals here, often act as if politics and economics are largely separate spheres, distinct, unconnected. The belief being that individual freedom is purely a political problem, while material welfare, like having enough food or housing, is purely an economic one.
And this leads to the idea that you can sort of mix and match, like pick your favorite political system and plug in whatever economic system you like.
Exactly. And the chief contemporary example of this delusion, as Friedman labels it, is the advocacy of what's often called democratic socialism. Many who rightly condemn the clear restrictions on individual freedom in, say, totalitarian socialism, think as the old Soviet Union, they're still convinced that a country can adopt the essential economic arrangements of socialism, yet somehow guarantee individual freedom just by having different political structures, like elections.
Okay, so Friedman's core thesis is a direct challenge to that. He's saying there's an intimate, inescapable connection between the two.
That's it precisely. He argues a socialist society, by its very nature, simply cannot genuinely guarantee individual freedom. It's a fundamental incompatibility in his view.
That is a strong claim, especially because it cuts against so much modern thinking. So if economic freedom is truly inseparable from political freedom, how does he break that down? Is he really saying my ability to choose, say, what job I take is as vital as my right to vote?
He is, absolutely.
Mm.
He argues economic freedom plays this dual role. It's both an end in itself, something valuable on its own, and it's a means to achieving political freedom.
Right.
Let's start with economic freedom as an end in itself, because he really emphasizes this point. It's crucial because it's often overlooked. He notes that intellectuals sometimes express a kind of contempt for the material aspects of life, seeing their own pursuits as somehow higher. But for most ordinary people, the direct importance of economic freedom, choosing your job, spending your money, starting a business, is just as significant, maybe even more tangible, than its indirect role in promoting political freedom.
So it's not just about having stuff, it's about fundamental life choices. Friedman gives this powerful example, doesn't he, about a citizen of post-World War II Great Britain.
Yes, who was literally unable to take a vacation in the United States simply because of exchange controls, government rules about currency.
Right, and Friedman says that's a deprivation of freedom just as real as a political restriction. Not being able to choose where you spend your own time and money because of economic rules, it's a direct hit on your personal choices, your life.
Exactly. Or consider the U.S. citizen who is compelled by law, forced to put something like, say, 10% of their income into a specific kind of retirement contract administered by the government, like Social Security. This, too, he presents as a direct deprivation of personal freedom. It limits your choice, over how you use your own money and how you plan for your own future. You don't get to decide the best way for you.
And he has that really dramatic illustration with the Amish farmers. That really stuck with me.
Oh, yeah. That's a stark one. On principle, they saw compulsory federal old age programs as infringing on their personal individual freedom, maybe even tied to their religious beliefs. They refused to pay the taxes or accept benefits.
And what happened? The government seized their livestock.
Some of their livestock were actually sold at auction to satisfy the claims for Social Security levies. Friedman argues this was felt by them as akin to a loss of religious freedom. It shows just how deeply these economic restrictions can touch personal convictions. It's not abstract. It hits very close to home.
Wow. And he gives other examples too, right? Things like being denied an occupation due to licensing laws.
Exactly. Or being prevented from trading goods with someone in another country because of quotas. Or, he mentions a specific case, a guy in California jailed for selling Alka-Seltzer below the manufacturer's set price under so-called fair trade laws.
Even a farmer being told how much wheat they're allowed to grow.
Right. All these, Friedman argues, are clear curtailments of economic freedom, and therefore they represent a significant loss of total freedom. They limit your ability to make fundamental decisions about your livelihood, how you interact with others, your daily life.
That really hammers home the idea that economic choices are deeply intertwined with personal liberty. Okay, so that's economic freedom as an end in itself. But how does it act as a means to political freedom? How does having economic choice protect my right to speak freely or vote, for instance?
Good question. Moving to its second role, economic freedom serves as an indispensable means to political freedom. The kind of economic organization that provides economic freedom, what he calls competitive capitalism, also promotes political freedom precisely because it separates economic power from political power.
Ah, separation of powers, but economic versus political.
You got it. This separation allows economic strength, which can be spread among many people and businesses, to serve as a vital check, a counterweight to political power, rather than reinforcing it. Think of it like another layer of checks and balances, but with decentralized economic forces offsetting the potential overreach of government. This prevents any single center of power, like the state, from becoming too dominant.
That makes a lot of sense conceptually. So what does history tell us? Does Friedman find concrete evidence for this connection, or is it more just a theoretical link?
History, Friedman states pretty emphatically, speaks with a single voice on this. Societies that have enjoyed a large measure of political freedom have almost always had an economic system comparable to a free market. He actually says he knows of no example in time or place otherwise.
No exceptions.
He points to examples like the 19th and early 20th century Western world, the Golden Age of Greece, the early Roman era times and places where political freedom emerged alongside or was closely associated with free markets and capitalist institutions.
Okay, so it seems like there's a strong correlation, but I can already hear some listeners thinking, wait a minute, what about countries like fascist Italy or Nazi Germany? They had private enterprise, didn't they? But they weren't exactly models of freedom. How does Friedman deal with that apparent contradiction?
That's a crucial distinction, and he addresses it directly. He readily admits that while capitalism appears to be a necessary condition for political freedom, it is definitely not a sufficient one.
Okay, necessary but not sufficient. Explain that.
It means you need capitalism, or something like it, to have political freedom. But just having capitalism doesn't automatically guarantee it. So yes, fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, Tsarist Russia, pre-WWII, Japan, they all had private enterprise as the dominant economic form, but none could be described as politically free.
So how does that fit his model?
Well, Friedman argues that even in those unfree societies, the very existence of private property provided some check, however limited, on centralized state power. It allowed individuals a degree of freedom, maybe just in their economic lives, that was greater than in truly modern totalitarian states like the Soviet Union, where economic and political power were completely fused.
So even if you couldn't openly criticize the government, the fact that you might find work in a private factory not directly dependent on a government official's okay offered a sliver of autonomy.
Exactly. A sliver that was simply absent, where the state controlled everything. It's about degrees of freedom, even in unfree societies. That's a subtle but important point he makes.
Interesting. He also traces how liberal thinking on this evolved, right? Back in the early 19th century, people like Jeremy Bentham saw it differently.
Yes, the early Benthamite liberals tended to view political freedom primarily as a means to achieve economic freedom. Their thinking was essentially give people the vote, ensure political reform, and they'll naturally choose laissez-faire economic policies because those policies lead to greater well-being.
And Friedman thinks they were kind of right.
He suggests they were, pointing to England, where political reforms did lead to significant economic reforms and a notable increase in the well-being of the masses.
But then things shifted.
Right. This triumph was followed by a reaction. The post-Benthamite era saw a growing movement towards government intervention in the economy, a trend that accelerated rapidly with the two world wars. Welfare, rather than freedom, became the dominant goal in many democratic countries.
And thinkers started to worry about this trend.
Precisely. Intellectual descendants of those early liberals, people like A.V. Dicey, Ludwig von Mises, and Friedrich Hayek, who wrote the very influential book The Road to Serfdom, they saw the danger. They recognized the implicit threat to individualism in this growing collectivism. So they shifted the emphasis. They began stressing economic freedom as the essential means to preserve political freedom, fearing that centralized economic control would inevitably lead down the path to serfdom, to a loss of liberty.
And the experience after World War II sort of tested these ideas in the real world.
It really did. Collectivist economic planning was widely adopted, and it did indeed interfere with individual freedom in many ways. But interestingly, in some countries like England, this didn't immediately lead to the complete suppression of political freedom as Hayek might have feared.
What happened instead?
Instead, it sometimes led to a reversal of economic policy. Friedman highlights the control of engagements order in post-war Britain. This would have involved the government allocating individuals to specific jobs, basically telling people where they had to work.
Wow, that sounds pretty extreme.
It was. And it clashed so sharply with ingrained ideas of personal liberty that it was apparently rarely enforced and very quickly repealed. This episode, Friedman argues, ushered in a shift away from central planning and towards greater reliance on the private market. It clearly illustrated, in practice, the very close relationship between political freedom and economic arrangements. You push economic control too far, and it visibly bumps up against personal liberty.
Okay, so let's dig into the logic here. How does the market actually manage to coordinate millions of people's economic activities without resorting to coercion? This seems like the core mechanism.
It is. For liberals, like Friedman, individual freedom. Maybe the freedom of the family unit is the ultimate goal when judging how society should be set up. And this concept of freedom, he stresses, is about how people relate to each other. It doesn't really apply to a Robinson Crusoe alone on an island. Crusoe faces limits, constraints from nature, but he doesn't have a societal freedom problem.
So freedom is about interactions. The liberals' goal isn't to tell you what to do with your freedom, ethically speaking, but just to make sure you have it in your dealings with others.
Precisely. Now, the fundamental problem of social organization, especially in our complex modern world with millions, even billions of people, is how do you coordinate all their economic activities, who makes what, who consumes what, how resources get allocated, without sacrificing that individual liberty.
And Friedman says there are basically only two ways.
Fundamentally, yes. One way is through central direction. This inevitably involves coercion, using force or the threat of force. It's the method of an army or a totalitarian state.
Okay, command and control.
Right. The other way is through voluntary cooperation of individuals. This is the technique of the marketplace.
Voluntary cooperation. How does that work on a massive scale?
It rests on a simple, yet he says often denied, proposition. Both parties benefit from an economic transaction, provided the transaction is voluntary and informed on both sides. If you don't think you'll benefit, you simply don't make the exchange. Nobody forces you. This is how the market achieves coordination, cooperation, without using force.
He uses that analogy of a collection of Robinson Crusoes, right?
Yeah, imagine each person is on their own little island producing whatever they're best at. Then they start trading with each other, exchanging goods on terms they both agree to.
This leads to specialization.
Exactly. People specialize in what they do best because they can trade for everything else they need. And this specialization leads to a huge increase in the total amount produced, far more than if everyone tried to be self-sufficient. Money, complex businesses, corporations, these are all just sophisticated tools that make this basic process of voluntary exchange easier and more efficient.
But for this voluntary exchange to really work, what conditions need to be in place?
He lists a couple of crucial conditions. First, enterprises must be private. Ultimately, individuals need to be the ones making the contracts. Second, individuals must be effectively free to enter or not enter into any particular transaction. Every exchange has to be strictly voluntary.
Does government have a role here then?
Yes, but a limited one. This system still requires government, but its role is basically to set and enforce the rules of the game. This means maintaining law and order, preventing physical coercion, like theft or violence, enforcing contracts that people entered into voluntarily, and clearly defining property rights, who owns what.
So, government as the umpire again, making sure everyone plays fair but not telling them how to play. He uses that quote, doesn't he? My freedom to move my fist.
Must be limited by the proximity of your chin.
Exactly. It's about preventing coercion, ensuring one person's freedom doesn't violently infringe on another's.
Okay. And he acknowledges there are tricky cases, exceptions where voluntary exchange might be difficult or really costly.
Yes, he mentions monopoly and what he calls neighborhood effects, what economists today usually call externalities.
Hmm.
He says these are the main justifications for potentially deviating from a purely voluntary system and promises to explore them more later.
Right. So sticking with the main mechanism, the market's central characteristic, he says, is that it prevents one person from coercing another in most activities. How does that work? It's the power of alternatives. The consumer is protected from being exploited by a seller because there are other sellers they can buy from. The seller is protected from being exploited by a consumer because there are other consumers they can sell to. The employee is protected from an employer because there are other employers they could potentially work for.
So competition provides the protection.
Exactly. And it happens impersonally, without any central authority dictating terms. Friedman actually suggests that a major objection many people have to a free economy is precisely that it does this so well. It gives people what they want, not what some particular group, maybe some intellectual elite or government planner, thinks they ought to want. He implies this objection often stems from a fundamental lack of belief in freedom itself.
That's a provocative point. He compares the market to proportional representation in politics, which I found interesting.
Yeah, it's a neat analogy. In a typical political system, the majority wins, and if you're in the minority on an issue, well, tough luck, you have to go along with the majority decision.
Like, everyone has to drive the same color car decided by vote.
Right. But in the market, it's more like proportional representation. You vote with your dollars for the color of tie you want, and you get it. Someone else wants a different color, they vote with their dollars, and they get that one. The market allows for an incredible diversity of tastes and preferences to be satisfied simultaneously in a way that centralized political decision-making simply cannot match.
Okay, so ultimately, political freedom means the absence of coercion by other people, and the fundamental threat to this freedom is always concentrated power.
Correct. Whether that power is held by a monarch, a dictator, an oligarchy, or even a temporary majority in a democracy that might try to suppress minorities. Preserving freedom, therefore, requires dispersing power, limiting it, setting up checks and balances.
And the market's role in this is crucial.
Absolutely. By removing the organization of economic activity from the direct control of political authorities, the market eliminates a massive source of potential coercive power. Economic power, unlike political power, can be widely dispersed. You can have many millionaires, many successful companies, but political power tends to be much more centralized. There's usually only one president, one prime minister, one central government making the key decisions.
And combining the two is dangerous.
That's his core argument.
Yeah.
When economic power is joined to political power, concentration becomes almost inevitable. And this combined power represents a far greater threat to individual liberty than either one alone.
To make this less abstract, Friedman gives some really striking real-world examples of how the market can protect political freedom, even for unpopular ideas. He asks, how could someone advocate for, say, capitalism in a genuinely socialist society?
It's a tough hypothetical. First, earning a living. In a truly socialist state, all jobs are ultimately controlled by the government. It's very difficult, he argues, for a government, even one with good intentions, to permit its own employees to actively campaign against its official doctrines. How long would a post office employee campaigning for privatization last?
Good point. And then there's the money issue. How do you fund unpopular causes?
Right. To advocate for anything significant, you need resources for meetings, pamphlets, maybe radio time back then. In a socialist society who has the spare funds, probably high public officials, and it strains credulity, Friedman says, to imagine them financing subversive activities like promoting free markets.
Whereas in capitalist societies,
Radical movements, both left and right, has historically often been supported by a few wealthy individuals, he calls them patrons, who are persuaded by an idea and willing to fund it, even if it's unpopular. Or sometimes by publishers or media outlets who take on a venture simply because they think it can be profitable, regardless of whether they personally agree with the message. The market breaks that vicious circle where you need mass persuasion before you can even get the funds to attempt persuasion.
He does add an important caveat, though, doesn't he? Advocating unpopular causes shouldn't be completely costless.
No, he agrees people should make sacrifices for things they deeply believe in. The goal isn't to make dissent free, but to ensure the cost is tolerable and not prohibitive. In a free market, if you somehow get the funds, you can usually buy paper from suppliers who, as he puts it, are as willing to sell it to the Daily Worker as to the Wall Street Journal. Their motive is profit, not ideology.
But in a socialist state,
You'd have to persuade a government-run factory to sell you paper, or a government-run printing press to print your message. That adds another huge layer of potential censorship and control.
this brings us to that compelling historical example he uses, the Hollywood blacklist during the McCarthy era.
Right. The blacklist, which barred alleged communists or sympathizers from working in the film industry, was essentially a collusive arrangement, an attempt by studios to use coercive means to interfere with voluntary exchanges, hiring actors and writers.
But Friedman argues it ultimately failed, or at least wasn't fully effective, precisely because of the market.
Exactly. The market made it costly to maintain the blacklist. Why? Because there was money to be made. Commercial interests, the drive for profit, led producers and studios to find ways around it, often hiring blacklisted individuals under pseudonyms or through fronts.
And if Hollywood had been, say, a government-run enterprise like the BBC in Britain,
It's hard to imagine those blacklisted individuals finding any work in the industry at all. And similarly, he argues, strong proponents of individualism or free markets would likely find themselves shut out of a government-controlled media landscape.
he also points out that during the McCarthy era itself, when government employees faced accusations, their fundamental protection, their ability to survive economically if fired, was the existence of a private market economy where they could still try to earn a living.
Many went into highly competitive sectors like small business or farming, and he makes that famous point. No one who buys bread knows whether the wheat from which it is made was grown by a communist or a Republican, or for that matter, by a Negro or a white.
It's the impersonality of the market.
Precisely. It separates economic activities from political views and protects men from being discriminated against for reasons that are irrelevant to their productivity. This leads him to that paradox he highlights. Minority groups, Black people, Jewish people, immigrants who arguably have the most to gain from competitive capitalism's protection against arbitrary discrimination, often disproportionately advocate for political and economic systems that actually undermine this protection. They mistakenly blame capitalism, he suggests, for the residual discrimination they still face, rather than recognizing the market as their greatest protector against even worse discrimination.
That's a really challenging perspective.
Yeah.
Okay, so if the market is the primary engine of coordination and protector of freedom, what then is the appropriate role for government in Friedman's view? It can't be nothing, right?
No, definitely not nothing. To a liberal, the ideal society relies on free discussion and voluntary cooperation, which means coercion should be minimized, but it can't be eliminated entirely. Government's core purpose, then, isn't to play in the economic game itself, but fundamentally to set and enforce the rules.
The umpire again.
Exactly. He sees government's main roles as providing a way to modify the rules when needed, acting as a forum for that, mediating differences when people disagree on how to interpret the rules, and enforcing compliance with the rules against those few who refuse to play fair. Just like in any game, most rules might be unspoken customs, but some need to be explicitly defined and enforced.
Because absolute freedom is impossible. Anarchy isn't feasible.
Right. Because human beings are imperfect, freedoms can clash. His fist in your chin analogy comes back here. One person's freedom, say, to murder their neighbor, must be restricted to preserve the other person's freedom to live. Government's first job is preventing coercion of that basic physical kind.
Okay, that seems straightforward. But it gets trickier in the economic sphere, especially with defining property rights. He says this is really complex and critical.
It is. Because what exactly is property? And what rights come with owning it? These aren't self-evident truths. They are, as he puts it, complex social creations.
Like, do you own the airspace above your land? How high up? Can someone fly a plane over it? How much noise is too much noise?
Exactly. Or think about intellectual property, copyrights, patents, royalties. These are all forms of property defined and enforced by social rules, by government. Friedman argues that the clarity of these property rights is often much more important than the specific definition chosen. Everyone just needs to know what the rules are so they can plan and interact effectively.
So, defining rights, enforcing contracts, preventing coercion. What else? Managing money. That seems like a big one.
It is. Friedman argues that government must provide a stable monetary framework. Historically, this meant things like coining money, ensuring its quality, maybe defining weights and measures. Today, it's more complex, involving central banks and regulating the money supply. But there's a real danger here, isn't there? That this necessary function expands into controlling resource allocation more broadly.
Right, it sounds like a delicate balance. How do you manage money without it becoming just another tool for government control? We'll get more into that later, I think. But first, what about those situations where he admits voluntary exchange might genuinely fail or be extremely costly?
Yes, the exceptions. He identifies two main classes, technical monopoly and neighborhood effects, or externalities. These are situations where relying purely on voluntary exchange is exceedingly costly or practically impossible.
Okay, let's unpack technical monopoly. This isn't just when one company gets big, right? It's when it's economically senseless to have competition.
Precisely. His classic example is the local telephone service, especially back then. Does it really make sense for multiple companies to dig up the streets and lay competing sets of wires to every single house? Probably not. That's a technical monopoly where efficiency dictates a single provider.
So if you have one of these, what do? Does the government take it over?
Yeah.
Regulate it heavily, let it run wild?
Here's where Friedman gets really counterintuitive for many people. He outlines three evils or undesirable options: private unregulated monopoly, public monopoly, government ownership, or public regulation of a private monopoly. And surprisingly, he often leans towards private unregulated monopoly if it's at all tolerable.
Really? Let the monopoly charge whatever it wants. Why?
His reasoning is, well, multifaceted. He thinks even a greedy private monopoly is often better than the alternatives because, first, it's still subject to potential future competition or technological change that might undermine its position. It has incentives to innovate, maybe more than a government agency. Second, public regulation, he argues, tends to get captured by the industry it's supposed to regulate.
Captured. You mean the regulators start serving the industry's interests instead of the public's?
Exactly. He uses the Interstate Commerce Commission, ICC, as a prime example. It was created to regulate railroads when they were arguably a monopoly, but even after trucks and airplanes eroded that monopoly power, the ICC continued, and its role effectively shifted to protecting the railroads from this new competition, and later even protecting existing trucking companies from new trucking companies.
Wow. So regulation can actually stifle competition it was meant to encourage? That's a classic case of unintended consequences. He also mentions the post office, doesn't he?
Yes, as an example of a public monopoly that is not a technical monopoly. It's a monopoly only because the law makes it illegal for private companies to compete in carrying first-class mail.
He mentions the Pony Express story.
Right, suggesting private enterprise was actually too efficient for the government to compete with back then, leading to laws suppressing private mail delivery. He speculates that if entry were freely allowed today, the mail industry would be revolutionized by competition.
Okay, so that's technical monopoly. What about the other exception? Neighborhood effects or externalities?
These happen when one person's actions impose significant costs or benefits on others. But it's not feasible to make the person pay for the costs or charge for the benefits through voluntary exchange.
Like pollution.
Pollution is the classic negative externality. If a factory pollutes a stream, it imposes costs, bad water, on people downstream, but it's hard for those downstream individuals to effectively charge the factory for that harm.
Or on the positive side, maybe basic education.
That's often cited. Educating children provides benefits not just to the children and their parents, but potentially to the whole community. Better citizens, lower crime, etc. It's hard to charge everyone in the community for these diffuse benefits.
What about things like roads?
Friedman uses highways as an example. For general city streets with lots of entry and exit points, directly charging tolls for every use would be incredibly cumbersome and costly. So a gasoline tax acts as a rough proxy, though it's imperfect. But for long-distance turnpikes with limited access points.
Tolls are perfectly feasible there.
Exactly. And Friedman sees no inherent reason why those couldn't be privately owned and operated, just like any other business charging for a service.
This leads him to a surprising example: national parks. He argues that while maybe small city parks have neighborhood effects justifying public funding,
national parks like Yellowstone generally don't. It is perfectly feasible to charge admission fees to cover costs, as is often done anyway, and many successful private parks and recreational areas exist. He says he can't really conjure up a strong monopoly or neighborhood effect argument that justifies government running Yellowstone.
So he's warning that neighborhood effects can become a catch-all excuse for almost any government intervention.
Pretty much. And he emphasizes that we always need to weigh the supposed benefits against the costs, including the crucial cost of limiting individual freedom. Intervention itself has a neighborhood effect, it restricts liberty, it needs to be put on the balance sheet, and he thinks the threat to freedom should be given considerable weight.
This brings us to what he calls the most troublesome justification for government action, especially for a liberal: paternalism.
Yes, the idea that some shall decide for others. Friedman acknowledges up front that freedom, as an objective, is really only tenable for responsible individuals. We don't typically advocate absolute freedom for, say, young children or people deemed legally insane. So, drawing this line between who is responsible and who isn't is unavoidable, creating an essential ambiguity.
How does he suggest handling those considered not responsible? Madmen, for instance.
For madmen, he suggests government care might be justified, partly due to the potential inadequacy of private charity to handle all cases, and partly because there's a neighborhood effect. We all benefit from potentially dangerous individuals being cared for.
Children are even more complex, he says.
Much more complex. While the family is usually the primary unit, children are seen as responsible individuals in embryo. They have their own ultimate rights. Parents are generally responsible for them, but they aren't absolutely free to do whatever they wish with their children. There are limits.
He has that rather uncomfortable insight comparing children partly to consumer goods.
Yes, it's a stark economic framing. Parents invest resources, time, money, in raising children, partly deriving satisfaction from it, like consumption. But children are also potentially responsible members of society. Once born, they have a path towards their own freedom.
But for liberals like Friedman, paternalism deciding for responsible adults is generally a big problem.
It's fundamentally objectionable, a hallmark of collectivism. While some measure of it might be unavoidable for those genuinely not responsible, like children or the severely mentally ill, it must always be approached with extreme caution, with humility, not arrogance. We should rely on free discussion and trial and error, not confident assertions that we know best.
He quotes A.V. Dicey on this, about entering a path.
Right? Dicey on the Mental Deficiency Act of 1914. The first step along a path on which no sane man can decline to enter, but which, if too far pursued, will bring statesmen across difficulties hard to meet without considerable interference with individual liberty. There's no magic formula, Friedman says, to tell us exactly where to stop on that path. We just have to use our fallible judgment.
So to make this concrete, Friedman gives a kind of laundry list of government activities common in the U.S. at the time that he argues cannot be justified by his principles of limited government: umpire role, technical monopoly, significant neighborhood effects, paternalism for the non-responsible.
Yes, it's quite a list, and it challenges many things taken for granted then and now. He includes things like agricultural price supports, tariffs, and export restrictions, government control over output, like oil production limits in Texas, rent controls, wage controls, minimum wage laws, maximum price controls like interest rate ceilings on bank deposits, detailed regulation of industries like the ICC for transport, FCC for communications, which he saw as implicit censorship, the existing social security system, compulsory annuities from government, occupational licensure beyond just a simple registration tax, public housing subsidies, peacetime military conscription, national parks as discussed, the legal prohibition on private companies carrying mail for profit, publicly owned and operated toll roads.
Wow, that hits a lot of areas where government is deeply involved. It gives a very clear picture of just how limited he thinks the government's economic role should be if freedom is the priority. Things like farm supports, minimum wage, Social Security, these are often seen as essential safety nets. How does he critique those specifically?
We'll get into his detailed critiques of those social welfare measures a bit later, but you can see the pattern he views them as exceeding the justifiable functions, often involving coercion of responsible individuals, interfering with voluntary exchange, and frequently having unintended negative consequences that undermine their stated goals.
Okay, let's shift focus now to monetary policy. This seems like a technical area, but Friedman argues it's deeply, deeply tied to freedom. He starts by challenging some historical narratives, right?
He does. He notes that buzzwords like full employment and economic growth became the primary justifications for massive government intervention, especially in the decades following the Great Depression. But he turns the conventional wisdom on its head.
Oh, so?
He argues that the Great Depression itself, like most other periods of severe unemployment, wasn't caused by some inherent instability in the private economy. Instead, he blames it squarely on government mismanagement. specifically the Federal Reserve's massive policy blunders in 1930 and 1931. He believes their actions turned what might have been a moderate recession into an absolute catastrophe.
So the problem wasn't capitalism failing, it was government failing.
That's his core assertion. And following from that, he argues that what we urgently need for both economic stability and sustainable growth is actually a reduction in government intervention, not more of it. He sees many existing government measures, high tariffs, complex tax codes, burdensome regulations as major impediments to growth and stability.
This leads back to that liberal dilemma for money. Government clearly needs some responsibility for providing a stable monetary framework, but how do you grant that power without creating a tool that could, as Lenin apparently suggested, be used to destroy a society?
Precisely. Control over money is incredibly potent. So how do you structure it? Friedman looks at the historical options. One is a fully automatic commodity standard, like the gold standard.
Does he think we should go back to gold?
No, he concludes it's neither feasible nor desirable today. For one thing, it involves using significant real resources just to produce the monetary commodity, digging gold out of the ground. More importantly, for it to be truly automatic and effective, it relies on a certain mythology and beliefs about its stability and immutability, beliefs that he thinks no longer exist. Plus, he notes even the historical gold standards were often managed by governments or central banks anyway, not purely automatic.
Okay, so gold standard is out. What about the other main approach? Giving broad discretionary power to an independent central bank, like the Federal Reserve System in the U.S.
He argues that's also a bad system, for two main reasons. First, the political argument. It gives a few men, the central bankers, enormous power over the economy without any effective check by the elected representatives or the public. It's fundamentally undemocratic in that sense.
And the second reason?
The technical argument. Even with the best intentions and expertise, central bankers are human. They will make mistakes. And given the complexity of the economy and the lags in monetary policy effects, mistakes are unavoidable. And these mistakes can have devastating consequences. Friedman famously paraphrases Clemenceau's quip about war being too serious for generals, saying, "Money is much too serious a matter to be left to the central bankers."
So if a rigid gold standard isn't feasible and giving discretionary power to central bankers is dangerous, what's the alternative?
His preferred solution is elegant in its simplicity. Rules instead of authorities. The goal is to achieve a government of law instead of men, even in monetary policy. Instead of letting central bankers decide what to do day by day based on their judgment, Congress should legislate clear, specific rules that the monetary authority must follow.
Rules for managing money, how would that work? He uses an analogy here, right, with the Bill of Rights.
Yes, it's a really powerful analogy. Think about the First Amendment guaranteeing free speech. Why do we have a general rule protecting speech, rather than having Congress or the courts decide case by case whether a particular opinion should be allowed?
Because if we voted on each case individually, say, should someone be allowed to advocate communism or atheism or some other unpopular idea, the majority might well vote to suppress speech in almost every single instance.
Exactly. We likely deny free speech in most specific cases based on the content. But Friedman argues, if you ask people to vote on the general principle of free speech as a whole, encompassing all potential cases, an overwhelming majority would likely support it.
Why the difference?
Because each person values their own right to speak freely, especially when they might be in the minority on some issue, more than they value suppressing someone else's speech. And, perhaps more importantly, we recognize, consciously or not, that the general rule of free speech has huge cumulative benefits. It allows for the generation of new ideas, experimentation, peaceful change benefits that wouldn't arise if every single expression required specific legislative approval.
Okay, so how does this apply to money?
The same logic holds. If you let monetary authorities decide policy case by case, reacting to every short-term fluctuation, they're likely to make mistakes, focusing only on the immediate issue and missing the broader cumulative consequences of their actions. But if you adopt a clear, pre-announced general rule for monetary policy, it creates stability and predictability. It positively influences people's expectations, their attitudes, their planning.
And what kind of rule does Friedman propose?
His specific proposal is for a legislated rule instructing the monetary authority, like the Fed, to achieve a steady, predictable rate of growth in the stock of money. He suggests a target rate somewhere in the range of 3% to 5% per year.
Why that specific range?
He argues the exact rate chosen is actually less important than the fact that a definite rate is chosen and stuck to. This would provide a stable monetary background against which the economy could adjust, preventing the monetary system itself from being a major source of economic disruption, as he believed it was during the Depression and other times. He also adds, based on his own research, that this approach aligns with findings suggesting government spending increases aren't as automatically stimulating as often assumed, because they tend to crowd out private spending, supporting a quantity theory view of money's impact.
That's a radically different approach to central banking than what we typically see. Okay, let's move from domestic money to international finance and trade. Friedman saw this area as a major threat.
Yes, he called it the most serious short-run threat to U.S. economic freedom at the time, aside from the possibility of all-out war.
Duh.
Specifically, he was worried about the potential imposition of far-reaching economic controls, supposedly to solve balance of payments problems.
What kind of controls worried him most?
Direct controls on foreign exchange, government rationing, who gets dollars to buy foreign goods or invest abroad. He points out these were perfected by Hjalmar Schacht under the Nazi regime in Germany, which should be a warning sign. He saw them as incredibly destructive to free enterprise, leading down a slippery slope, a never-ending spiral of more and more detailed rationing, production controls, and government intrusion into private transactions.
And he was concerned that even proponents of free enterprise might fall for these controls.
Yes, he mentions even someone like Senator Barry Goldwater, a staunch conservative, had sometimes suggested such restrictions as a temporary cure for balance of payments deficits. Friedman's response is blunt. The cure would be vastly worse than the disease. He also strongly criticizes the U.S. government's actions back in 1933-34 when it nationalized gold, prohibiting private citizens from owning it. He saw this as fundamentally destructive of the principles of private property, comparing it implicitly to Fidel Castro's nationalizations in Cuba. It showed, he thought, a strange blindness among some free enterprise supporters when it came to gold.
He uses a bank analogy to explain balance of payments issues, right?
Yeah, just like a commercial bank needs to manage its inflows and outflows and maintain confidence to avoid a run by depositors, a nation faces similar issues with its balance of payments, the flow of money for trade and investment, and the risk of capital flight if confidence erodes. He argued the U.S. at the time was flailing, unwilling to adopt any one coherent policy, resorting instead to a patchwork of measures, including things like import quotas and supposedly voluntary export restrictions.
And he distinguishes between tariffs and these direct controls.
Yes, he thinks tariffs are bad, they interfere with free trade. But quotas and other direct interferences are even worse. Why? Because they are less impersonal. Tariffs are just a tax, albeit a distorting one. Quotas involve government officials making specific decisions about who gets to import or export, how much, and from where. This creates opportunities for favoritism, corruption, and administrative discretion, offering valuable plums, as he puts it, to specific private interests.
So if direct controls are terrible and tariffs are bad, what's the free market solution for international finance and trade?
He argues there are really only two mechanisms consistent with a free market. One is a fully automatic international gold standard, which, as we discussed, he deemed neither feasible nor desirable anymore. The only remaining consistent option is freely floating exchange rates.
Meaning the value of the dollar versus the yen or the euro would just be determined by supply and demand in the market, like the price of anything else, without government intervention to fix or manage the rate.
Exactly. Let the market decide the price.
Why was there so much resistance to this idea back then?
He identifies several reasons. Simple inertia, the tyranny of the status quo, confusion between truly floating rates and the unstable pseudo-gold standards, or heavily managed systems that often existed. The self-interest of some groups, particularly international bankers, who might prefer the certainty, or perceived certainty, of fixed prices. And a common misinterpretation of history, people often blamed floating rates for economic instability, when Friedman argued the floating rates were usually just a symptom of underlying economic instability, like high inflation or government mismanagement, not the cause of it.
So his goal isn't necessarily unstable rates.
Not at all. His ideal is a system where exchange rates are free to adjust if necessary, but would likely be relatively stable if the underlying domestic economic policies, especially monetary policy, were stable and predictable. The flexibility is the safety valve.
And how does this connect to trade policy? What's his path to free trade?
His stance is bold and principled. Unilateral free trade. Don't wait for other countries to lower their barriers, just do it yourself. He points to Britain's example in the 19th century when it repealed the Corn Laws, tariffs on grain, without demanding reciprocal action from others.
His argument being that our tariffs hurt us as well as other countries?
Precisely. We shoot ourselves in the foot with protectionism. He proposed a concrete plan. Legislate a gradual phase-out. For example, raise all import quotas by a fixed percentage, say 20% each year until they become meaningless, and simultaneously reduce all tariffs by a fraction, say 1/10, each year for 10 years until they reach zero.
That sounds pretty radical, even today.
It is. But he believes such a move would do more to promote the cause of freedom at home and abroad than almost any other single government measure. It represented a consistent, principled stance based on the benefits of free exchange.
Okay, let's switch gears significantly now to the government's role in education. This is another area where Friedman's ideas were and remain quite controversial. He starts by making a distinction.
Yes, a crucial one. He distinguishes between general education for citizenship and specific vocational schooling. The focus, he argues, should be on the broader goal of education, not just the institutional structure of formal schooling, which in the U.S. is mostly administered by government.
What are the standard justifications for government getting involved in education at all?
He identifies the two main ones we discussed earlier in the context of government functions: neighborhood effects and paternalism.
How do those apply here?
The neighborhood effect argument is that a basic level of education for everyone, things like literacy, maybe some shared understanding of civic values, benefits the whole society, not just the individual student or their parents. It makes democracy work better, potentially reduces crime, etc. Since it's hard to identify and charge all the beneficiaries for these diffuse positive externalities, this might justify requiring some minimum level of schooling and subsidizing it through general taxes.
And paternalism.
That's the concern for children, who are presumed unable to make fully informed choices for themselves. Since parents are acting as guardians, society might step in to ensure children receive a certain basic education, even if some parents wouldn't provide it voluntarily.
Okay, so he concedes there might be grounds for requiring and subsidizing some basic level of schooling, but he's highly critical of the way it's typically done.
Extremely critical. While government subsidy might be justified by these arguments, government administration of schools, what he bluntly calls the nationalization of the education industry, is much harder to justify on liberal principles.
Why? What are the problems with government running the schools directly?
He sees several major problems. It leads to inefficient spending, often focused on superficial things like magnificent structures and luxurious grounds, rather than the quality of actual teaching and learning. It tends to result in a lack of flexibility and innovation, and promotes excessive conformity. Everyone gets pushed towards the same model.
And it creates that double payment issue for parents who want something different.
Exactly. If you're unhappy with the local public school and want to send your child to a private school, you still have to pay your school taxes, plus the private school tuition. This heavily penalizes choice and restricts options, especially for lower and middle-income families.
So what's his alternative? If government subsidizes but doesn't run the schools, how does that work? This is where the famous voucher system comes in.
Precisely. His liberal alternative is the voucher system. The government would still mandate a minimum level of schooling, paid for by taxes, justifying the neighborhood effect argument. But instead of giving the money directly to government-run schools, it would give parents vouchers representing a certain amount of funding per child.
And parents could use these vouchers where?
They could spend them at any approved educational institution, whether it's a government-run public school, a private nonprofit school, a private for-profit school, as long as it meets certain minimum standards.
What would be the benefits of this, in his view?
He argues it would unleash the power of competition. Schools would have to compete for students and their voucher money, leading to greater diversity of options, more innovation, increased efficiency, and more responsiveness to parents' desires. Teacher salaries might become more flexible and market-driven, and it would solve the double payment problem, giving all parents, not just wealthy ones, genuine choice in their children's education.
He acknowledges the historical melting pot role of public schools.
Yes. He notes that public schools arguably played a useful role in assimilating immigrants, teaching English, and fostering common values in the past. But he suggests that the problem today, or rather in 1962, is less about assimilation and more about excessive conformity. What's needed now, he felt, is more diversity and choice, which vouchers would encourage.
What about higher education, colleges and universities?
He believes the case for government nationalization, running state universities, is even weaker here. The neighborhood effects are less clear, and students are adults capable of making choices. If there's justification for subsidy, Perhaps to promote equality of opportunity, he argues it should primarily go directly to students, perhaps through loans or vouchers, not to institutions. Let students choose where to spend the money, forcing universities, public and private, to compete for them.
He uses that Ohio scholarship example.
Right, where state scholarship money could only be used at a state university. He calls that an unfair program that artificially props up state institutions and unfairly disadvantages private ones, stifling competition and choice.
He also brings up this interesting economic concept, investment in human capital. Can you explain that?
Sure, education and training aren't just consumption, they're also an investment. You invest time and money now, in college, vocational training, in the expectation of earning higher income later. It's like investing in a machine, but you're investing in a person's skills and knowledge, their human capital.
But there's a problem with financing this kind of investment in the free market.
Yes, a significant market imperfection. It's much harder to get a loan to finance education than to get a mortgage for a house or a loan for a factory. Why? Because you can't really use the asset, the person, as collateral in the same way. You can't repossess someone's brain if they default. Also, the investment is inherently risky. The person might get sick, die, or just not be as successful as hoped.
So because it's hard for individuals, especially those without wealthy families, to borrow for education, society tends to underinvest in human capital.
That's the argument.
Hmm.
Potentially high-return investments in people don't get made because the financing isn't available on reasonable terms.
What's Friedman's proposed solution to this market imperfection? It's not just government subsidies, is it?
No, he proposes a more market-oriented solution. Equity investment in human beings. Instead of a traditional loan with fixed repayments, an investor, or maybe a specialized institution, would provide funds for education in return for the student agreeing to pay the investor a fixed percentage of their future earnings for a set number of years.
So if you become very successful and earn a lot, you pay back more. If you earn less, you pay back less.
Exactly. It aligns incentives and spreads the risk. The successful individuals effectively subsidize the less successful ones within the investor's portfolio. Friedman argues this would dramatically increase equality of opportunity by making capital available to anyone with ability, regardless of their background.
Why doesn't this happen more often privately?
He suggests several reasons: high administrative costs of tracking earnings and collecting payments, a general societal reluctance to explicitly view human beings as capital in this way, and perhaps legal limitations on financial institutions making these kinds of contracts.
So if government were to get involved here, what should it do?
Friedman argues that if government intervention is deemed necessary to overcome this market imperfection, it should focus on facilitating this equity investment model, perhaps by setting up the legal framework or even acting as an initial financing agency. It should not, he stresses, just provide outright subsidies or nationalize higher education, as those approaches lead to inefficiency, overinvestment in certain areas, and often perverse redistribution of income, for subsidizing middle and upper-class students with taxes from lower-income workers.
Okay, let's move to another really sensitive and important topic, capitalism and discrimination. Friedman makes a striking historical claim here, doesn't he?
He does. He asserts that, historically, the rise and development of capitalism has consistently been accompanied by a significant reduction in discrimination against particular religious, racial, or social groups.
What evidence does he offer for this?
He points to broad historical trends. The decline of serfdom coincided with the rise of free markets. Jews, often facing severe restrictions in medieval Europe, survived and sometimes thrived through their participation in market activities. Groups facing disabilities in England, like Puritans and Quakers, were able to accumulate wealth through trade and industry, enabling some to migrate.
And his example from the American South after the Civil War.
Right. He notes that while Southern states imposed many discriminatory black codes restricting the rights of newly freed slaves, they almost never barred them from owning property. This, he suggests, reflected a fundamental belief in the principle of private property that was so strong it overrode even intense racial prejudice, providing a crucial, if limited, avenue of opportunity. More broadly, he argues, discrimination tends to be most severe in monopolistic sectors, where there's less choice, and least prevalent where there's free, open competition.
Why is the market inherently anti-discriminatory, in his view?
It comes back to that impersonal nature of market transactions. As he says, the person buying bread doesn't know or usually care about the personal characteristics, the religion, race, politics of the farmer who grew the wheat, the miller who ground the flour, or the baker who made the loaf. What matters is the quality and price of the bread.
So if someone refuses to deal with you based on an irrelevant characteristic like race, you can potentially take your business elsewhere.
Exactly. The market provides alternatives. An employer who insists on hiring only people of a certain group, even if less qualified candidates are available from other groups at a lower wage, is imposing a cost on himself. He's choosing less efficient production for the sake of his prejudice. In a competitive market, such employers tend to be penalized. They lose out to competitors who focus on productivity regardless of irrelevant characteristics. This impersonal pressure protects individuals from discrimination based on things that don't affect their economic contribution.
Which leads back to that paradox you mentioned earlier.
Yes, the paradox that minority groups, who arguably benefit most from the protection against arbitrary discrimination offered by competitive capitalism, often end up advocating against capitalism. He thinks they mistakenly blame the market system itself for the residual discrimination that still exists, often supported by government actions or private monopoly power, he would add, rather than recognizing the market as their most powerful ally in combating prejudice.
This leads him to strongly criticize policies like Fair Employment Practices Commission's FEPC legislation, which were designed specifically to combat discrimination in hiring. That seems counterintuitive. Why oppose laws aimed at preventing discrimination?
His argument here is based on a fundamental principle about the role of government and the nature of harm. He distinguishes sharply between what he calls positive harm and negative harm.
Okay, what's the difference?
Positive harm involves direct coercion or violence against someone or their property, things like assault, theft, breach of contract. Government, he agrees, should intervene to prevent this kind of harm. That's part of its core umpire function. Negative harm, on the other hand, is simply the inability to enter into a mutually agreeable contract with someone. For example, if a consumer chooses not to buy your product, or an employer chooses not to hire you.
So someone deciding not to associate with you voluntarily isn't harm in the sense that justifies government intervention.
Not in Friedman's view. Preventing negative harm, forcing people to associate or transact against their will, fundamentally violates the principle of voluntary cooperation and individual freedom. He uses the example of a community preferring a blues singer over an opera singer. The opera singer might feel harmed by the community's taste, but it's not coercion, and the government shouldn't force the community to hire the opera singer.
And FEPC laws fall into this category of preventing negative harm.
Yes. He sees them as the state, telling employers whom they must contract with, interfering with voluntary association. Furthermore, he raises a point of principle. If the state has the power to compel non-discrimination, doesn't that logically imply it also has the power to compel discrimination? He points to Hitler's Nuremberg laws, which mandated discrimination as being similar in principle to FEPC laws, in the sense that both involved the state dictating criteria for private association. Accepting FEPC, he argues, erodes the principled liberal opposition to any state control over individuals' private choices regarding whom they associate or transact with.
That's a tough argument for many people to accept. He also points fingers at labor unions.
Yes, he argues that labor unions, often granted legal immunities and exemptions from antitrust laws, frequently use their resulting monopoly power to discriminate against certain groups, like black workers historically, by controlling entry into trades or workplaces.
What about school segregation? That was a huge issue then. Since government was running the schools, it seemed forced to choose between enforcing segregation or enforcing integration.
Friedman saw this as a dilemma created by government operation of schools. He viewed both compulsory segregation and compulsory integration as bad options, as both involved the state dictating patterns of association. The appropriate liberal solution, in his view, wasn't for the government to choose which pattern to enforce, but to get out of the business of running schools altogether.
Back to the voucher system.
Exactly. Let parents choose the schools their children attend, reflecting their own preferences regarding association. Society, meanwhile, could work to foster anti-discrimination attitudes through persuasion and education, but not through government coercion in schooling.
Okay, let's move on to monopoly more generally, and this related idea of social responsibility for businesses. How does he define monopoly first?
He makes an important distinction between competition in the everyday sense, rivalry, and competition in the economic sense. Economic competition is impersonal. It means there are enough buyers and sellers that no single participant can significantly affect the price. Monopoly, in contrast, exists when a single seller, or a small group acting together,
Yeah.
has sufficient control over a product or service to largely determine the price or terms of sale.
And monopolies are a problem because they limit voluntary exchange.
Yes, they restrict alternatives and can lead to coercion or exploitation. But they also raise this tricky issue of social responsibility.
What's the issue there?
For a business operating in a truly competitive market, the idea of social responsibility, beyond obeying the law and competing fairly, doesn't really arise. They're just trying to survive and make a profit. But for a monopolist, or a powerful corporation, or a strong labor union leader, it's easy for people to argue they should use their power not just for profit or for their members, but to further broader socially desirable ends, like curbing inflation, reducing pollution, promoting diversity, etc.
And Friedman has a very strong reaction to this idea.
Extremely strong. He argues that accepting this doctrine of social responsibility for private actors would fundamentally destroy a free society. He calls it a fundamentally subversive doctrine.
Wow. Why so strongly worded? What's so dangerous about businesses trying to do good?
His argument is sharp and clear. A corporate executive is an employee of the owners, stockholders. Their primary responsibility is to conduct the business according to the owner's desires, which generally will be to make as much money as possible while conforming to the basic rules of society, both those embodied in law and those embodied in ethical custom.
So the one and only social responsibility of business is
To use its resources and engage in activities designed to increase its profits so long as it stays within the rules of the game, which is to say, engages in open and free competition, without deception or fraud. Similarly, the primary responsibility of labor leaders is to serve the interests of their members.
He's channeling Adam Smith here, the invisible hand.
Absolutely. Smith's insight was that by pursuing their own self-interest, profit, individuals and businesses are led, as if by an invisible hand, to promote the broader interests of society, often more effectually than when he really intends to promote it. Friedman fully embraces this.
So why is asking businesses to pursue social goals directly so dangerous?
Several reasons. First, who gets to decide what the social interest or socially desirable ends are? If corporate executives start deciding these things, they're effectively acting like public servants imposing taxes by spending stockholder money on social causes and making expenditures, functions that should belong to elected government officials accountable to the public.
They become unelected regulators or legislators.
In effect, yes. And if they start acting like public officials, Friedman argues, it won't be long before the public demands they be chosen like public officials through political processes. This would destroy the private nature of the enterprise. Second, it confuses the lines of accountability. Executives are accountable to owners, politicians to voters. Mixing these roles undermines both systems.
He uses that example of President Kennedy pressuring U.S. Steel.
Yes, Kennedy publicly condemned U.S. Steel for raising prices in 1962, effectively treating a private pricing decision as a matter of public policy. Friedman saw this as a striking illustration of how much potential power for state control, power needed for a police state, already existed if private economic decisions are framed as having overriding social responsibilities subject to government pressure.
And what if businesses or unions voluntarily try to act responsibly, say, by holding down prices or wages to fight inflation?
Friedman argues this is also misguided and harmful. If they successfully keep prices or wages below the market clearing level, it inevitably leads to shortages, rationing, black markets, and ultimately calls for government intervention to manage the mess they created. It undermines the price system's ability to coordinate activity. Besides, he argues, widespread inflation isn't caused by the greediness of businessmen or workers. It's caused by government mismanagement of the money supply. Asking private actors to fix it through social responsibility is asking them to treat the symptoms while ignoring the disease and likely destroying the free market in the process.
So where do monopolies actually come from, if not primarily from greedy businesses? He revisits the sources.
Right. He identifies three main sources. One, technical considerations, as discussed, like the local phone company. He thinks these are relatively limited and often temporary due to technological change. And even here, he often prefers private, unregulated monopoly if tolerable. Two, private collusion. Businesses secretly agreeing to fix prices or restrict output, conspiracy against the public, as Adam Smith called it. Friedman thinks this is inherently unstable without government help because there's always an incentive for individual firms to cheat on the agreement by lowering prices slightly to gain market share. Antitrust laws are important primarily because they make these collusive agreements harder to form and legally unenforceable. 3. Direct and indirect government assistance. This, Friedman argues, is by far the most important source of monopoly power in the modern era.
How does government create or support monopolies?
Directly, through things like tariffs, which protect domestic firms from foreign competition, or explicit grants of monopoly privilege, like the post office mail monopoly. Indirectly, through things like tax legislation. He points to the way corporate and individual income taxes were linked, incentivizing established corporations to retain earnings rather than pay them out, making it harder for new competitors to raise capital. And very importantly, through labor legislation that grants special immunities and privileges to unions, allowing them to exercise monopoly power over labor supply, control entry into trades, and sometimes engage in coercive tactics that would be illegal for other organizations.
So the main problem isn't usually businesses achieving monopoly on their own, but government policies enabling or creating it.
That's his strong contention.
Given this diagnosis, what's the appropriate government policy towards monopoly?
First and foremost, he argues, government needs to stop actively supporting monopolies, eliminate tariffs, abolish special privileges for unions that allow them to restrict competition, reform tax laws that unintentionally hinder new entrants. Second, enforce the existing antitrust laws even-handedly against both business and labor monopolies where they arise from private collusion.
And he suggests a major tax reform.
Yes, a radical one. Abolish the corporate income tax entirely. Instead, require corporations to attribute their earnings to their individual stockholders, who would then pay personal income tax on those earnings, whether distributed as dividends or not.
Why would that help fight monopoly?
He argues it would eliminate the incentive for corporations to retain earnings just to avoid taxes, forcing them to compete for capital in the open market. This would invigorate capital markets, make it easier for new enterprises to get funding, and thus promote competition. He also advocates drastically scaling down the high marginal rate of the personal income tax.
Okay, let's turn finally to social welfare measures. Friedman argues that many programs designed with good intentions to help the poor or achieve other social goals often have effects very different indeed from those intended. He starts with public housing.
Right. The stated intent was usually to improve housing for the poor, eliminate slums, maybe address supposed neighborhood effects of bad housing.
How does he critique it?
First, on the rationale.
Right.
If slums have negative neighborhood effects, he suggests maybe taxing the slum property owners would be a more direct way to address it. If the goal is simply to help poor people, giving them cash grants is far more efficient and respects their freedom more than giving them housing in kind. Recipients almost always prefer cash, which they can use to meet whatever they see as their most pressing needs, which might be food or clothing, not necessarily different housing.
And what about the actual effects of public housing programs as he saw them?
His assessment is scathing. He claims they often destroyed more dwelling units through slum clearance than they built, actually increasing overall housing density and potentially worsening conditions for many poor people who were displaced. He also argues the programs quickly became dominated by special interests, like construction firms and real estate developers, focused on clearing blighted areas, which might just be low-income areas ripe for redevelopment, rather than truly focusing on housing the poorest. And despite massive spending, urban blight persisted.
What about minimum wage laws? Also well-intentioned, presumably.
Intended to help low-income workers by ensuring a living wage. But Friedman argues their main effect is to increase unemployment, especially among the least skilled workers, teenagers, and minority groups. By making it illegal for employers to hire anyone for less than the mandated minimum, it effectively prices workers whose skills are not yet worth that minimum out of the market. They simply don't get hired. The primary beneficiaries, he argues, are those workers who keep their jobs at the now higher minimum wage, often slightly higher skilled workers or union members, and perhaps unions who support the minimum wage, partly to reduce competition from lower wage non-union labor.
And farm price supports, another program ostensibly to help the poor farmer.
Again, he argues the reality is very different. The benefits are distributed roughly in proportion to output, meaning the largest, wealthiest farmers receive the vast majority of the subsidies, while small, low-income farmers get very little. It's inverse to need. Furthermore, the programs are incredibly inefficient. A large chunk of the money spent goes to storage costs, administration, or inputs like fertilizer induced by the supports, not into farmers' pockets.
What are the other costs?
Consumers pay twice, once through taxes to fund the subsidies, and again through higher food prices at the store. Farmers themselves face burdensome government controls on what and how much they can plant. It creates a massive bureaucracy, and it complicates foreign policy by generating agricultural surpluses that distort international trade. He sees it as a policy failure on almost every level.
Now, the big one, Social Security, specifically the Old Age and Survivors Insurance, OASI program.
Yeah.
How does he dissect this?
He makes several key criticisms. First, redistribution. He argues it's not true insurance, where premiums relate actuarially to benefits. Instead, it functions primarily as a system for transferring income. And the transfer is often perverse. It involves a highly regressive tax. Payroll taxes hit lower earners harder as a percentage of income, financing benefits that aren't strongly related to need. It mainly redistributes from younger generations to older ones, and often from those who earned low incomes throughout their lives to those who had higher average lifetime earnings.
Second, he objects to the nationalization aspect.
Yes. Why compel people to buy their retirement annuities, specifically from the government? If government provision is truly more efficient, let it compete with private companies in a free market. Forcing people to buy from a government monopoly limits individual freedom, prevents private market innovation in retirement planning, and creates a huge, self-perpetuating bureaucracy within government, whose experts inevitably become biased towards expanding the program, making effective political control by Congress almost impossible.
And his most fundamental objection is to the compulsory purchase itself.
Absolutely. This goes back to the paternalism argument. The justification for forcing everyone to buy an annuity is essentially paternalistic. We, the government, know better than you what's good for you. You might not save enough for old age on your own. Friedman strongly rejects applying this logic to responsible people.
He has that quote about freedom and mistakes.
Yes. Those of us who believe in freedom must believe also in the freedom of individuals to make their own mistakes. It requires humility, he says, not the arrogance of the paternalist who thinks they know best for everyone else.
Is there any liberal justification for compulsory purchase?
The only one he considers potentially valid on liberal grounds is the argument that the improvident, those who don't save, might become public charges later, imposing costs on everyone else. Therefore, forcing them to save avoids this future burden.
But he rejects this argument too.
He argues it depends crucially on the facts. Was widespread improvidence really the main problem? The Great Depression made this argument seem plausible, but he blames the Depression on government mismanagement, not on people suddenly becoming irresponsible savers. He also argues that private arrangements for retirement and old age care, pensions, insurance, family support, had evolved significantly and would evolve further if not crowded out by the government program. The cost of restricting the freedom of the vast majority to compel saving, just to avoid the potential burden of a relatively small number becoming public charges, seemed far too high to him.
So, if all these major social welfare programs are flawed in his view, what's his alternative for genuinely alleviating poverty? Does he think government should do nothing?
No, not necessarily nothing. He first acknowledges that capitalism itself has been incredibly successful at reducing absolute poverty on a massive scale. He also stresses the importance of private charity, which he sees as a desirable and important recourse that flourished in earlier laissez-faire periods, but has been somewhat diminished by the expansion of government welfare.
But he does see a potential role for government.
Yes, he concedes that government action to alleviate poverty can be justified, even on liberal grounds, using the neighborhood effect argument. The argument is that the existence of poverty imposes costs on the rest of society, perhaps through crime, disease, or simply the moral distress many feel at seeing extreme deprivation. Since we all benefit from reducing poverty, but private charity might be insufficient, due to free rider problems, people hoping others will donate, government action can be seen as a way for us all to agree to contribute to achieving a common objective, setting a minimum standard of living, a floor below which no one should fall.
But the crucial thing is how government should help.
Exactly. The how is critical. Programs should aim to help poor people as people, simply because they are poor, not because they belong to a specific group, like being a farmer or elderly or living in a certain type of housing. We should address the problem, poverty, directly, not through roundabout, inefficient, and freedom-limiting programs targeted at symptoms or specific groups.
This leads to his most famous and perhaps most radical proposal in this area, the negative income tax, NIT.
That's right. He argues the NIT is the simplest, most direct, and most freedom-compatible way to alleviate poverty using government action.
How would it work?
Instead of the complex patchwork of existing welfare programs, food stamps, housing subsidies, etc., you would simply use the existing income tax system. If your income is above a certain level, you pay tax. If your income falls below a certain minimum level, the poverty line or some fraction of it, the government pays you. You receive a payment from the government, a negative tax, to bring your income up towards that minimum floor.
Just give people cash.
Essentially, yes, based on their reported income.
And he argues this would be more efficient.
Dramatically so.
Mhm.
He points out the massive amounts spent on various welfare programs in 1961, around $33 billion,
Mm.
and calculates that this sum, if distributed directly as cash grants, could have theoretically lifted all families then below the poverty line above it, with money left over.
Hmm.
This suggested to him that the existing programs were incredibly wasteful, with huge amounts going to administration or benefiting people who weren't actually poor. And NIT, he estimated, could achieve the goal of establishing a minimum income floor for far less cost, perhaps less than half the amount than being spent.
What are the potential downsides or dangers he sees with the NIT?
The main one he flags is political. The NIT makes the process of redistribution very explicit. Some people are clearly taxing themselves to pay subsidies directly to others, and those receiving the subsidies also have the right to vote. The danger is that this could create political pressure for the majority to continually raise the guaranteed minimum and the tax rates on the minority paying for it, potentially turning it into a system where the majority simply votes itself benefits funded by taxing an unwilling minority.
So it relies on political restraint.
Yes, ultimately it depends on the self-restraint and goodwill of the electorate to keep the system focused on providing a basic floor and not let it spiral into excessive redistribution that undermines incentives and freedom. He mentions Dicey's concern from 1914 about giving pensioners the vote, but notes that while Britain's experience with welfare had been mixed, it hadn't destroyed liberty, and he saw glimmerings of a turning of the tide towards more restraint.
This brings us back to that distinction he makes between liberalism and egalitarianism. How does the NIT fit into that?
For Friedman, the true liberal believes fundamentally in individual dignity, freedom, and equality of rights and opportunity. Material equality might be a welcome byproduct of a free society that opens opportunities for all, but is not the primary goal itself. Liberals would support measures that promote both freedom and equality, like breaking down monopolies or improving education access. They view private charity as a proper expression of freedom. If they support state action to alleviate poverty, like the NIT, it's seen as potentially a more effective way for individuals to achieve a common objective they largely agree on, preventing destitution, but always with some regret at having to substitute compulsion for purely voluntary action.
And the egalitarian.
The egalitarian goes further. They see material equality as a desirable end in itself, and are therefore willing to justify taking from some to give to others, specifically for the purpose of reducing income inequality, even if it infringes on individual freedom or doesn't necessarily align with equality of opportunity. The NIT, for a liberal like Friedman, is acceptable only if viewed as a way to ensure a basic minimum, not as a tool for achieving broader income equalization.
Okay, so after dissecting all these specific areas, money, trade, education, welfare, monopoly, what's Friedman's overall verdict on government intervention? He notes a big shift in how people thought about this over time.
Yes, a really critical shift in perspective. He argues that back in the 1920s and 30s, many intellectuals came to favor government control because they were comparing the existing reality of capitalism, with all its imperfections like monopolies or depressions, to an idealized vision of government intervention, how government could work if it were run by perfectly wise, informed, and disinterested public servants acting solely for the general good.
An unfair comparison, basically. Reality versus utopia.
Exactly. But now, Friedman says, writing in 1962, after several decades of large-scale government intervention in practice around the world, we can make a more realistic comparison. We can compare the actual operation of the market, warts and all, with the actual results of government interventions.
And his conclusion from this real-world comparison.
It's absolutely stark. He concludes that the difference between the actual operation of the market and its ideal operation, great though it undoubtedly is as nothing compared to the difference between the actual effects of government intervention and their intended effects. The gap between government's promise and its performance is vastly larger than the market's. He points to the reality of Soviet Russia, massive tyranny, as a devastating counterpoint to the earlier utopian hopes for communism.
And he lists many specific examples of government programs that backfired.
Yes. He rattles off a list of U.S. government ventures. The Silver Purchase Program in the 30s, public power projects like TVA, foreign aid programs, the SEC regulating broadcasting, urban redevelopment, agricultural stockpiling, arguing that almost all of them had effects very different and generally quite opposite from what their proponents intended.
Does he concede any government successes?
He does acknowledge some limited areas where government action achieved its physical objectives, demonstrating its power to command resources, building impressive expressways, large dams, launching satellites. He also gives some credit to the public school system for widening opportunities, despite his critique of its structure, to the Sherman Antitrust Act for fostering competition to some extent, and to public health measures for reducing infectious diseases. Law and order has been maintained, though he notes inconsistencies.
But overall,
Overall, he concludes, the record is dismal. The immense progress the U.S. had made in feeding, clothing, housing its population, improving living standards, narrowing class distinctions, advancing culture. This was overwhelmingly the product of the initiative and drive of individuals cooperating through the free market. Government measures, far from being the source of this progress, generally hampered not helped this development.
he has that memorable line about the invisible hand versus the visible hand.
Yes, the invisible hand of the market has been more potent for progress than the visible hand of government for retrogression.
So why do government interventions so often fail or backfire, according to Friedman? What's the fundamental flaw?
The fundamental flaw, he argues, is that most government interventions try to force people to act against their own immediate interests in order to promote some supposedly general interest. They inherently involve substituting the values of outsiders, government officials, reformers, for the values of participants, the individuals actually involved in the activity.
And people resist this.
Naturally, these measures are inevitably countered by one of the strongest and most creative forces known to man, the attempt by millions of individuals to promote their own interests, to live their lives by their own values. People find ways around the regulations. They exploit loopholes. They adapt in unforeseen ways. This human ingenuity in pursuing one's own goals is why the effects of intervention are so often the opposite of what was intended. It's also, ironically, why pervasive government regulation doesn't completely strangle a free society. People are incredibly resourceful at getting around rules that conflict with their fundamental interests.
And when he says interest, he doesn't just mean narrow financial self-interest, right?
No, that's a crucial clarification he makes. Interests encompass the whole range of values people hold dear, including wanting to help others, pursuing charitable goals, practicing their religion, seeking knowledge, creating art. The great virtue of a truly free society, he argues, is that it permits this full scope of human values and interests to be pursued voluntarily. This, he suggests, is why capitalist societies, despite the focus on profit, are often less narrowly materialistic than collectivist societies where the state dictates values.
This reminds me of that dicey quote he uses about why people tend to favor intervention despite its track record.
Yes, Dicey's insight about the natural bias towards intervention. Dicey observed that the beneficial effect of state intervention is direct, immediate, and, so to speak, visible. You see the new road being built, the check arriving in the mail, whilst its evil effects are gradual and indirect and lie out of sight.
Like the businesses that never started because of regulation or the general loss of dynamism.
Exactly. Most people don't see the subtle corruption, the stifling of initiative, or how state help kills self-help over the long run. This creates a built-in bias toward favoring government action, a bias that Friedman argues can only be counteracted by a strong presumption or prejudice in favor of individual liberty, that is, of laissez-faire. You need to start with a default assumption in favor of freedom.
So concluding, Friedman sees two major threats to freedom in the modern world.
Yes. One is the obvious external threat from totalitarian states, which at that time meant primarily the Soviet Union, the evil men in the Kremlin, as he puts it.
And the other threat.
The other, perhaps more subtle and insidious, is the internal threat. This comes not from evil men, but from men of good intentions and goodwill who wish to reform us.
People who genuinely want to help but believe the state is the best tool.
Precisely. They are impatient with the slow, messy process of voluntary cooperation and persuasion. They are confident in their ability to wield the power of the state for good ends. Yet, Friedman warns, if they succeed in concentrating that power, they will not only likely fail to achieve their specific aims, but they will also inadvertently create a collectivist state from which they would recoil in horror and of which they would be among the first victims.
He has that powerful warning about concentrated power.
Yes. Concentrated power is not rendered harmless by the good intentions of those who create it. Good intentions are not enough. The structure of power itself is the danger.
And these two threats, external and internal, can reinforce each other.
Unfortunately, yes. For example, the need for large military spending to counter the external threat inevitably concentrates enormous economic power in the hands of the government, which itself poses an internal threat to the free market and individual liberty. We needlessly intensify this danger, he argues, by continuing widespread government intervention in many other areas unrelated to defense.
So what's the path forward? Is he optimistic?
He believes we can preserve and even extend freedom, but only if we awake to the threat from both external enemies and well-intentioned internal reformers. We need to persuade our fellow citizens that relying on free institutions and voluntary cooperation offers a surer, if perhaps at times a slower, route to achieving our shared goals than resorting to the coercive power of the state. He ends the book on a note of cautious hope, sensing some glimmerings of change in the intellectual climate, a potential turning of the tide back towards an appreciation of freedom.
Okay, so let's try to quickly recap the core ideas we've unpacked from Milton Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom. We've explored his really powerful argument that economic freedom isn't just about money or material things. It's a fundamental, inseparable part of overall individual liberty. And it's absolutely essential, a necessary condition for political freedom to exist.
Right. And we learned how the free market, through its unique mechanism of voluntary cooperation and competition, works to inherently disperse power. It protects individuals from coercion, whether from the state or from each other, far more effectively, in his view, than any centralized government system possibly could. The market acts as a crucial shield for our liberties.
And we saw Friedman's framework for the government's role limited but essential. It's primarily to be the umpire, setting and enforcing the rules of the game like property rights and contracts, mediating disputes, and only intervening beyond that in very specific cases of genuine market failure, like true technical monopolies or significant neighborhood effects. And even then, always weighing the cost to individual freedom.
And we dove into his sharp critiques of many common government interventions, things like Social Security, minimum wage, public housing, occupational licensing. He showed quite compellingly how these well-intentioned policies can often have vastly different, frequently negative, and profoundly unintended consequences, largely because they substitute the values and judgments of outsiders for those of the individuals directly involved, disrupting the market's natural coordination.
Yeah. Ultimately, Friedman makes this incredibly strong case for a society that trusts individual initiative, that trusts the voluntary interactions of the invisible hand of the market, much more than it trusts the visible hand of government planning and control, even when we're facing really complex societal problems like poverty or discrimination. It's a vision that consistently, rigorously prioritizes individual liberty as the ultimate measure of a good society.
So here's a final thought for you, the listener, to ponder. Considering Friedman's arguments, how might your own understanding of concepts like progress or social justice, or simply helping others change, if you consistently try to evaluate government actions, not just by their stated goals or good intentions, but by their actual, often unseen impact on individual liberty and the functioning of voluntary exchange? What specific area of public policy, maybe one we discussed today or one we didn't, would you most want to re-examine through this challenging Friedmanite lens, where freedom is the ultimate benchmark?